The November rain did not merely fall, it executed a rhythmic, percussive assault on the asphalt of the Upper East Side, each drop a freezing chemical bullet shattering against the neon-veined streets of Manhattan. Inside Castellanos, the atmosphere was a manufactured velvet sanctuary, thick with the heavy, cloying scent of aged balsamic, roasted garlic, and the sharp, metallic tang of expensive silver. Amina moved through this gilded enclosure with a gait she had perfected over 3 grueling years, a fluid, predatory silence that allowed her to exist in the periphery of the powerful without ever occupying their psychic space. At 25, her skin possessed the deep, lustrous sheen of unpolished mahogany, catching the flicker of the vintage chandeliers in a way that made her feel more like a carved sentinel than a living woman. The weight of the circular tray pressed into the callous meat of her palm, the friction of the non-slip surface vibrating against her skin as she navigated the narrow channels between mahogany chairs. Her feet, encased in sensible black leather that had long since surrendered its structural integrity to the architecture of her bones, throbbed with a dull, rhythmic heat. She was a shadow in a starched white blouse, a ghost serving gods. The heavy kitchen doors hissed shut behind her, momentarily severing the connection between the diner's hushed conspiracies and the sweltering, industrial chaos of the back of house. The scent changed instantly, shifting from the delicate, expensive perfume of white truffles to the visceral, humid roar of simmering pomodoro and the acrid smoke of searing veal. Amina felt the perspiration bloom along the nape of her neck, a salty trickle that cooled rapidly as she re-entered the climate-controlled elegance of the floor. She checked her station at table 7, her eyes scanning for the microscopic imperfections that defined her value: a misaligned fork, a thumbprint on a crystal rim, a salt cellar running low. Her internal physiology was a tightly wound spring of calculated efficiency, her heart rate hovering at a steady 60 beats per minute even as the pressure of the Saturday rush mounted. She had learned to read the room like a technical manual, interpreting the tilt of a chin or the sudden stillness of a conversation as indicators of imminent needs. The invisibility she cultivated wasn't a lack of presence, it was a weaponized form of observation. It was her armor. Everything shifted when the front door opened, admitting a draft of ozone-soaked air and a man who didn't so much enter the room as colonize its molecules. Minho Park walked with a calculated, terrifying stillness, his presence acting as a gravitational well that pulled the attention of every server and sommelier in the building. He was 35, with features chiseled from a single block of cold basalt, his eyes a dark, unreadable void that catalogued the room in one comprehensive, lethal sweep. He wore a charcoal gray suit with a subtle windowpane check, the wool so fine it seemed to absorb the ambient light rather than reflect it, tailored with a mathematical precision that suggested coiled violence beneath the elegance. Amina felt the thrum of adrenaline in her fingertips, a sharp, electric tingle that signaled a shift in the evening's stakes. This wasn't just another CEO or a hedge fund architect with a bloated ego and a thirst for Burlo. This was the man who held the invisible strings of the city's underworld, a figure of mythic brutality wrapped in the skin of a gentleman. The air grew brittle. The room held its breath. Antonio, the manager whose joviality usually bordered on the performative, approached Amina with a face that looked as though it had been drained of its last drop of blood. He leaned in close, the scent of bitter espresso and cold anxiety heavy on his breath, and whispered the instructions for Table 1, the private alcove in the rear. Impeccable, Amina. No mistakes, no delays, and for the love of everything holy, no listening, he said, his fingers twitching rhythmically against the seam of his trousers. She nodded, the movement barely a ripple in her frozen composure, while her mind began to map the logistics of a five-top in the most sensitive corner of the establishment. The private room was a cavern of burgundy silk and deep shadows, the air inside stagnant and heavy with the scent of old money and fresh rain. As she prepared the initial water service, Amina gripped the chilled glass carafe, the condensation slicking her palm like engine oil. She thought of her daughter, Amara, currently tucked into a borrowed bed at Mrs. Adebayo's apartment, her small face illuminated by the flickering blue light of a nightlight. Every drop of sweat, every biting remark from a customer, and every hour of invisibility was a brick in the wall she was building around her child. She moved toward the door. She became the silence. The 5 men in the private room were arranged like pieces on a grandmaster's chessboard, their postures rigid and their expressions shielded by the dim, flickering light of the low-slung chandelier. Min-ho sat at the head, his back against the solid mahogany wall, his hands resting flat on the table in a display of deceptive, leonine calm. To his right was an empty chair, a hollow space that seemed to vibrate with expectation, and across from him sat Vincent, a man whose features were buried under layers of soft, expensive living and a lifetime of cruelty. Amina moved counterclockwise, the technical veracity of her training guiding her hands as she poured the mineral water at a precise 45-degree angle. The liquid hit the bottom of the crystal glasses with a soft, hollow chime, the bubbles rising in silver columns that caught the amber light. "The Barolo, the 15, Vincent grunted, his voice a gravelly rumble that broke the heavy, pressurized silence of the room. Amina nodded, her eyes lowered as she retreated to the wine station, her mind already calculating the decanting time for a vintage of that density. She felt Minho's gaze on her, a physical weight that traveled down her spine like a cold finger. He didn't look at her like a server. He looked at her like a variable. As she reached for the heavy-bottomed Barolo bottle, the cold glass felt like a relic from another life, reminding her of the heavy iron pots her grandmother used to stir in the heat of a Lagos afternoon. That memory, sharp as a blade, contrasted violently with the sterile, high-stakes luxury of the Manhattan dining room where a single bottle cost more than her rent. She began the uncorking process, the screw of the waiter's friend biting into the cork with a satisfying, organic crunch before it was extracted with a muted, professional pop. She poured a small amount into a tasting glass, checking for clarity and the deep, garnet hue that indicated proper aging, the tannins clinging to the sides of the glass in long, slow-moving legs. The men were speaking in a coded shorthand now, a technical jargon of logistics and unforeseen liabilities that Amina processed without acknowledging. She stepped back to the table, her movements economical and devoid of wasted energy, her internal focus narrowed to the sensory feedback of the environment. The thud of a distant car door, the hum of the ventilation, the smell of copper. The final guest, a younger man named Thomas who wore his wealth with a frantic, overeager energy, arrived 15 minutes late, his overcoat still dripping with the city's grime. He took the seat to Minho's right, offering a smile that didn't quite settle on his face, his movements jerky and filled with a nervous, kinetic tension that set Amina's teeth on edge. Amina poured his wine, noting the way his hand shook slightly as he reached for the glass, his fingers fumbling with the stem before he set it back down with a clink. Something in the room shifted, the cadence of the conversation changing from a steady flow to a series of sharp, staccato interruptions. She sensed a disruption in the choreography, a vibration in the floor that didn't match the rhythm of the restaurant's usual, polished pulse. She retreated to the shadows near the door, her peripheral vision locked on Thomas, whose eyes were darting toward Minho's glass with a frequency that bordered on the pathological. Her heart began to thrum against her ribs, a frantic, bird-like beating that she had to manually suppress. Danger had a specific frequency. She could feel it in her marrow. The betrayal happened during the transition between the antipasti and the main course, a moment of calculated chaos as plates were cleared and fresh silver was laid with mathematical precision. Thomas reached across the table, ostensibly to point at a line in a document Vincent had produced, his sleeve brushing against the edge of Minho's untouched wine glass. Amina, standing 4 feet away with a stack of soiled linen, saw the movement that no one else in the room was looking for. It was a micro-gesture, a practiced sleight of hand that involved a tiny, translucent vial palmed against the meat of his thumb. She saw the nearly imperceptible tilt, the drop of clear fluid falling into the deep, dark red of the Barolo, and the way the liquid rippled for a fraction of a second before settling. Thomas's face remained a mask of professional interest, his voice steady as he discussed the quarterly projections for their shipping interests in the Adriatic. Amina felt the world slow down, the air growing thick as syrup as she calculated the remaining seconds of Minho's life. He was reaching for the glass. His fingers were closing on the stem. Her mind raced through the protocols of her life, the safety of her daughter, and the crushing weight of her invisibility. To speak would be to die, or, at the very least, to be discarded, a witness to a crime that had yet to reach its bloody conclusion. But the visceral image of Minho's body hitting the mahogany floor, the life draining out of him while his associates watched with feigned shock, created a cold, hollow ache in her gut. She wasn't a soldier and she wasn't a saint, but she was a mother who knew the value of a life held in the balance by a thread. As she moved toward the table to refill the water, her elbow caught the corner of Minho's water glass with a force that was too deliberate to be accidental, but too chaotic to be questioned. The glass toppled, a cascade of ice and mineral water flooding directly into Minho's lap, the cold liquid drenching his expensive trousers. "Oh, God," she gasped, her voice a perfect pitch of horror and feigned incompetence. "I am so sorry, sir. Please let me." Minho stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the hardwood floor with a sharp, violent screech that silenced the entire room like a gunshot. The conversation at the table died instantly, the air vibrating with the sudden, jagged tension of the interruption. Vincent let out a short, bark-like laugh, the sound grating against the silence, but Minho remained motionless, his eyes fixed on Amina with a terrifying, piercing clarity. He didn't look at the water on his suit, and he didn't look at the shattered glass on the floor. He looked at her, searching for the crack in her performance. Amina didn't look away, her face a mask of subservient distress even as her adrenaline peaked, making her fingertips feel like they were on fire. "It's fine," he said, his voice a low, dangerous silk that seemed to vibrate in her very marrow. Accidents are the hallmark of a busy room. He didn't sound convinced. He sounded curious. Amina scrambled to produce linens from her apron, her hands shaking with a genuine tremor that added a layer of technical veracity to her charade. She knelt to gather the shards of glass, the sharp edges biting into the pads of her fingers, the tiny stings of pain grounding her in the moment. "I'll replace the wine, sir. Immediately. Everything will be fresh," she stammered, her voice breathless. She reached for the poisoned glass, her hand extending toward the dark liquid that held a lethal secret, but Minho's hand shot out with the speed of a striking viper. He caught her wrist, his grip not painful but absolute, a band of heat that anchored her in place. The room went cold. The silence was absolute. "Leave it," he commanded, his eyes locked on hers, searching the depths of her iris for the truth she was trying to hide. Amina froze, the heat of his skin contrasting with the icy sweat on her own, her pulse hammering against his thumb like a trapped bird. She could see the amber flecks in his dark eyes, the sharp intelligence that was currently dismantling her reality piece by piece. She nodded once, a sharp, jerky movement, and he released her, his hand retreating into the pocket of his jacket, as if the contact had never happened. "Get me a fresh glass," he said to the room at large, but his gaze never left Amina's face. She backed away, her heart a frantic, uneven rhythm in her chest, the air in the private room suddenly feeling too thin to breathe. She had crossed a line. She was visible. In the kitchen, the roar of the service felt like a physical assault, the heat from the grills making her dizzy as she leaned against a stainless steel prep table. Antonio was there in seconds, his face a mask of fury and panic, his hands gesturing wildly at the closed doors. "What have you done, Amina? Do you have any idea who that man is?" he hissed, his voice cracking. She didn't answer, her focus inward as she fought to regulate her breathing, the scent of searing garlic suddenly nauseating. She grabbed a fresh glass and a new bottle of Barolo, her movements mechanical, her mind already projecting the fallout of her decision. She returned to the room, her composure restored by a sheer act of will, and performed the service with a clinical, detached precision. Thomas was quiet now, his face a sickly shade of ashen gray, his eyes fixed on the poisoned glass that sat untouched at the edge of the table. The meal continued. The trap had failed. The rest of the dinner passed in a blur of sensory overload. The clinking of silver, the heavy scent of lamb, the low, guttural murmur of men who dealt in life and death. Min-ho ate sparingly, his movements deliberate, his attention divided between his guests and the woman who had just ruined his suit. When Thomas excused himself to use the restroom, his face slick with a cold sweat that suggested a sudden, violent illness, Min-ho's eyes followed him with the predatory focus of a hawk. 5 minutes later, a commotion erupted from the hallway, the sound of a body hitting a wall, a muffled groan, and the frantic footsteps of the kitchen staff. Thomas was being carried out, his face a mask of agony, his body convulsing with the first stages of a cardiac event that shouldn't have happened for another 20 minutes. He had sampled his own wine when he thought no one was looking, a desperate attempt to prove it was safe. He was dying. The room was silent. Min-ho stood slowly, his expression a masterpiece of cold, unyielding indifference as he watched his associate being dragged toward the exit. He turned back to the table, his gaze settling on Amina, who was standing in the corner with her hands clasped in front of her, her knuckles white. The other men were shouting, calling for an ambulance, their voices a chaotic roar that Min-ho ignored with the ease of a man who had seen everything. He walked toward her, his footsteps silent on the hardwood, until he was standing so close she could smell the rain on his coat and the faint, citrus scent of his cologne. "You have a very specific set of skills, Amina," he said, the use of her name a sharp, electric shock that made her breath hitch. She didn't look up. She didn't move. "I just served the food, sir," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the din of the restaurant. He reached out, his hand lifting her chin until she was forced to meet his gaze, the intensity of his focus, making her feel as though she were being dissected. "No," he said, his voice a soft, dangerous rasp. "You save lives when it isn't convenient. That makes you a liability to some and a treasure to others." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a stack of $100 bills, laying them on the table with a flick of his wrist. "For the dry cleaning," he said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. And for the silence, he turned and walked out, his associates trailing in his wake like a wake of vultures. Amina stood alone in the burgundy room, her heart a heavy, slow thud in her chest. The invisible girl was gone. The target was born. The subway ride home to Queens was a descent into a different kind of darkness, the flickering fluorescent lights of the train car casting long, distorted shadows across the faces of the tired and the broken. Amina sat with her bag clutched to her chest, her fingers tracing the edges of the bills in her pocket, the physical weight of the money a constant reminder of the bridge she had burned. She thought of the way Min-ho had looked at her, the respect in his eyes clashing with the inherent danger of his world. She had traded her invisibility for a debt of honor, a currency that was more volatile than the cash in her hand. When she reached her apartment, the scent of old wood and Mrs. Adebayo's jollof rice greeted her, a domestic comfort that felt fragile and temporary. She checked on Amara, pressing a kiss to her daughter's warm, soft forehead, the scent of baby powder and innocence making her throat tighten with a sudden, violent sob. She had done this for her. She had risked everything for a future she couldn't even see. The next morning, the world felt different, sharper, louder, filled with hidden meanings and subtle threats. As she walked Amara to school, Amina found herself scanning the street for the black SUVs and the men in charcoal suits, her instincts tuned to the frequency of the hunt. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, an unknown number flashing on the screen, the vibration a rhythmic, insistent demand for attention. She answered on the third ring, her voice steady even as her heart hammered against her ribs. "Hello." The voice on the other end was smooth, professional, and entirely unfamiliar. "Miss Amina, my name is David. I'm calling on behalf of Mr. Park. He would like to discuss a more permanent arrangement for your security." Amina stopped in the middle of the sidewalk, the city rushing past her like a river she was no longer a part of. "I'm a waitress," she said, the words feeling hollow and absurd. "I don't need security." Mr. Park disagrees. The voice replied, the tone brook no argument. Thomas Brennan's associates are currently looking for the person who disrupted their timeline. You are no longer invisible, Amina. You are the only witness to a failure they cannot afford. She looked at Amara, who was skipping ahead, her backpack bouncing against her small shoulders, and felt a cold, paralyzing fear wash over her. She had saved a king, and in doing so, she had made herself a pawn in a game she didn't know how to play. Where? She asked, her voice cracking. Vuvio's. 8 o'clock tonight. Don't be late. The line went dead. She stood in the morning sun, the warmth of the light feeling like a mockery of the cold reality that was closing in on her. She was a mother. She was a savior. She was a target. Vuvio's was a corner coffee shop that smelled of roasted beans and desperation, a place where people came to disappear in plain sight. Amina arrived 10 minutes early, her eyes scanning the room until she found Minho sitting in a back booth, his back to the wall and his eyes on the door. He looked different without the suit, more human, but no less dangerous, his black sweater emphasizing the breadth of his shoulders and the stillness of his posture. She sat across from him, her hands folded on the table, the technical detail of her environment fading into the background as she focused on the man who now held her life in his hands. You're late, he said, though he hadn't looked at a watch. I had to put my daughter to bed, she replied, her voice gaining a strength she didn't know she possessed. He nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. Family is the only thing worth the risk. He pushed a folder across the table, the leather cover soft and expensive under her fingertips. Thomas is dead. The oleander extract was more potent than his heart could handle, he said, his voice devoid of emotion. But the people who gave it to him are still very much alive. They know a waitress in an Italian restaurant saw the vial. They know she's the reason their coup failed. Amina opened the folder, her eyes widening as she saw photos of her apartment, her daughter's school, and the diner where she worked her second shift. You've been watching me, she whispered, the betrayal feeling like a physical blow. I've been protecting you, he corrected, his gaze unwavering. There is a house in Westchester. Secure, gated, with a staff that answers only to me. You and your daughter will move there tonight. I can't just leave my life, she argued, the absurdity of the situation finally breaking her composure. I have a job. I have a degree I'm working toward, Minho leaned forward, his intensity a physical force that pinned her to the seat. Your life ended the moment you spilled that water, Amina. Now, you're choosing whether you want to live the next 1 inch. He reached out and covered her hand with his, the heat of his skin grounding her in the chaos. I don't leave debts unpaid. You saved my life. Now let me save yours. She looked at his hand, then at the folder, then at the dark, knowing eyes of the man who had become her unintended destiny. The city outside was a blur of lights and shadows, a million lives intersecting and diverging in the cold November night. She took a breath, the air tasting of ozone and coffee. When do we leave? The safe house was a fortress of glass and stone, a beautiful, sterile cage that smelled of pine and lemon oil. Over the next week, Amina watched through the reinforced windows as the world she knew was dismantled and rebuilt by Minho's men. She learned the technical details of his world, the encryption on his phones, the caliber of the weapons carried by her guards, and the intricate financial webs he wove to keep his empire afloat. She spent her days with Amara in the sprawling garden, the sound of her daughter's laughter a fragile, precious music that kept the darkness at bay. Minho visited every evening, his presence a steady, grounding force that she found herself anticipating with a confusing mix of fear and longing. They talked for hours, two people from different worlds finding common ground in the silence of the Westchester night. He told her about his father, the man who had built an empire on blood and ambition, and the weight of the crown he had inherited. She told him about Lagos, the heat of the sun, and the woman who had helped her escape a life of violence with nothing but a phone number and a promise. We're the same, you and I, he said one night, the moonlight silvering his features. We're both survivors who forgot how to live. She looked at him, the man who was both her captor and her savior, and saw the loneliness that mirrored her own. I haven't forgotten, she said, her voice a soft, steady vow. I'm just waiting for the rain to stop. He reached out, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw, a gesture of tenderness that broke the last of her defenses. It stopped, Amina. You can come inside now. The final confrontation happened on a Tuesday, a cold, gray day that felt like a premonition. Minho's men had intercepted a team of hitmen on their way to the house, a violent, clinical extraction that Amina only heard about in whispered reports. By the time the sun set, the threat had been neutralized, the conspiracy dismantled with the same mathematical precision that Minho applied to everything. He came to her room that night, his face tired but his eyes clear. It's over, he said, the words a release she hadn't expected to feel. You're free to go back to your life. I've set up a trust for Amara, and your tuition at NYU has been paid in full. Amina looked at him, the man who had changed the trajectory of her existence with a single look across a dining room. What if I don't want to go back? She asked, the question hanging in the air like a challenge. He didn't answer immediately, his gaze traveling to the window where the lights of the city were visible in the distance. My world is a dangerous place, Amina. I can't promise you safety, only my presence. She walked toward him, her movements no longer the silent, submissive crawl of a waitress, but the confident stride of a woman who had seen the abyss and walked away. I've never been safe, she said, her hand finding his. But I've never been seen until you. He pulled her close, his heartbeat a steady, rhythmic drum against her ear, the scent of him filling her senses. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the world cold, clear, and full of a terrifying, beautiful potential. They stood together in the silence of the fortress, two survivors who had found a way to bridge the chasm. The waitress and the boss. The savior and the saved. The story was just beginning.